Would you eat something that could kill you, if it was your only hope to survive? It's the middle of winter, the fire is dying. The wind howls through the cracks of a wooden hut buried in snow. A man kneels on the frozen ground, trembling. His hands are cracked, his lips pale. In one hand, a twisted root, blackened, bitter, dangerous. His stomach growls, his children are watching. He has no choice. This is not fiction. This was survival in the Middle Ages. In a time with no electricity, no grocery stores, and no second chances, your life depended on secrets passed down in whispers. A single mistake meant agony. A wrong route meant death by nightfall. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's nearly -7 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the fields. The forest was silent, hiding danger behind every leaf. And yet, they found a way, with no doctors, no books, and no modern science, just instinct and ancestral courage. They discovered forbidden techniques, techniques that turned poison into food and desperation into survival. These are the secrets they never told you. Today you'll learn how medieval survivors turned deadly plants into sacred nourishment. But beware, some knowledge came at a terrible cost. The snow never stopped falling, thick, relentless, silent. It buried the rooftops of thatched cottages, crept through the cracks of shutterless windows, and turned the dirt paths of the village into white rivers of despair. By the time it reached the fire pits, it hissed and vanished, like hope had been trying to speak, but was silenced once again. Inside one of these wooden huts, a small fire fought for life. Its flames were weak, flickering. They painted trembling shadows on the faces of a family huddled in silence. The mother stirred something in a blackened pot, her hands blistered and wrapped in cloth. The smell was earthy, sour, not soup, not food. It was desperation boiling over soaked roots, bark, maybe something from deep in the woods, something no one could name anymore. Outside, the wind screamed, not in anger, but in warning. The cold had fallen below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's almost -7 degrees Celsius. It was no longer weather, it was an enemy, the kind you couldn't outrun or outsmart. Just resist, and maybe endure. This was the core of medieval survival. No heaters, no emergency plans, just instinct and ancestral courage. When the sun set, sometime around 16 hours of daylight, all that was left was darkness and breath. And in some huts, even the breath ran out. The medieval peasant lived by rules modern minds wouldn't dare accept. They didn't read manuals. They read the land, a whisper in the snow, a mark on a root, the way a fire burned when you added a certain branch. That was their science. That was their faith. In those frozen villages, one mistake with a plant meant not just death for the eater, but for the family that had to watch. And so, they trusted what their ancestors taught them. Forgotten wisdom passed down through stories. And scars. Every leaf had a name, every root a risk, and every winter a cost. The silence of those nights was not peace, it was a warning. Every creak of wood could be the end of a roof. Every cough in the dark, the beginning of loss. Still, they stayed. Still, they resisted. This wasn't just surviving. It was remembering. It was honoring. And while we sit today, warm, connected, safe, the question remains, would your soul endure the silence of that village? What feeling would live in your chest if you were there? Right now at 22 hours of the night at night, listening to the wind scrape against wood. Tell us in the comments, would it be fear or something older than fear? Not all plants were poison, but many were, and worse than the hunger itself was not knowing which was which. Out there, in the frozen woods, beneath layers of snow and dirt, roots twisted in the dark like secrets. Some were safe, others were death wrapped in a layer of bark. And sometimes, in the hunger of winter, the medieval peasant didn't get to choose. They simply took what they could find and prayed. That's when one of the most vital techniques of medieval survival came into play. A method passed from grandmother to mother, from father to son. No books, no parchment, just hands, memory, and desperation. They would boil the roots, not once, but twice, 3 times, sometimes 4. Each time the water darkened, as if the poison itself were bleeding into the pot. The root softened, The bitterness faded. Slowly, carefully, they removed the water, discarded it far from the hut, and filled the pot again. Fresh snow melted over the fire. The process repeated. It wasn't chemistry, it was trust. Trust in the old ways. Trust in ancestral techniques. And it wasn't just about making food edible. It was about turning danger into salvation. The smell was sharp, sour, almost metallic. Children weren't allowed near the pot during the process. They knew too well. A single sip of the first water could twist your insides until the screams echoed through the snow. This method was more than survival. It was ritual. Each boil was like a silent prayer whispered to the ancestors. Each bubble that broke the surface of the pot carried a message. We are still here. We are still fighting. In those frozen villages where the sun set around 16 hours of the day and temperatures fell below 15 degrees Fahrenheit, this technique saved lives. It was a shield without steel, a medicine without a name. But there was always risk. Not all poison could be boiled away. Not all roots obeyed the same rules. Sometimes people got it wrong. That's why this knowledge was sacred, protected, almost forbidden to speak aloud in front of strangers. Because if the wrong person heard it and used it wrong, it could end more than a meal, it could end a family. Still they boiled. Still they hoped. And while the modern world forgets, the snow remembers. Have you ever seen water turn black from something meant to feed you? Would you dare eat what your ancestors feared? Let us know in the comments. Would you have the courage to trust the old ways? Or would you let hunger speak louder than caution? Sometimes boiling wasn't enough. There were plants so dangerous, so soaked in bitterness and invisible death, that even fire couldn't wash them clean. That's when the medieval peasant turned to the rivers, to the patience of nature itself, to a technique as old as the first frost, passed down from one frost-bitten generation to the next. They called it water leeching. But it wasn't science. It was ritual, a sacred gesture repeated every winter, like the rhythm of the heartbeat. Beneath the snow, when the frozen villages ran out of safe food and the stores had long been emptied, they gathered what the earth still offered. Wild roots, some bitter to the tongue, others simply unknown. Wrapped in woven baskets of wood and bark, the roots were lowered into the icy current of nearby rivers. Not just for minutes, not for hours, for days. The stream would whisper over them day and night. It would draw out the poison grain by grain, drop by drop, as if the forest itself was deciding whether to forgive the hunger of man. During that freezing weather, while the winds howled through leafless branches and the sun vanished by 17 hours, the water kept its silent watch, flowing, cleansing. But it wasn't perfect. Sometimes the snow would come too fast, the river freeze too early, and the baskets would be lost beneath the ice. Sometimes children, desperate and cold, would eat too soon. A root pulled from the water after one night instead of 4. And then pain, convulsions, quiet that followed the screams. Still, they returned to the river each year, because they knew, they had learned, they had witnessed, the water could do what fire could not. It could save. This was the quiet power of ancestral techniques. No machines, no chemicals, just current and time. A patience most of us today have forgotten, buried under convenience and speed. But for those who lived through the hunger in the Middle Ages, this wasn't about choice, it was about survival. About watching the snow fall on your doorstep and wondering if your family would be strong enough to see it melt again. In the dead silence of winter, the river became a whisper of hope, flowing beneath the ice, unseen, but never forgotten. And now, centuries later, we ask ourselves, would you wait 4 days in the cold, watching a stream carry away the poison, while your stomach begged for anything at all? If these ancestral survival techniques touch something ancient in your soul, something buried but not broken, support our mission. Leave a like, subscribe, keep the flame of forgotten wisdom alive. Today we open a plastic package. We scan a barcode. We toss out what doesn't smell quite right without a second thought. A small beep, a microwave hum, a warm plate in 2 minutes. Food is comfort. Food is abundance. Food is safety. But in the Middle Ages, food was danger in disguise. In those frozen villages beneath a sky that turned dark before 17 hours, and a wind that scraped skin like knives. A root wasn't just a root. It was a test. You didn't unwrap it. You unearthed it, frozen, tangled, coated in ice, and you didn't know if it would nourish you or kill you slowly by morning. There was no expiration date, no label, no hotline, only memory, only instinct, only the echo of someone else's mistake. Back then, food was the last gamble of the night. And imagine this. What if the lights went out tonight, completely? No electricity, no stores, no signal, just silence, just cold. Would you know what to eat? Would you know what to fear? Would your hands know what your ancestors once touched? In the comfort of the modern world, we've outsourced wisdom, replaced ancestral techniques with apps and appliances, but remove one wire, just one, and our world starts to shiver. And when your home drops to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, when the fridge hums no more, when the food spoils faster than you can eat, what then? Do you think you'd recognize edible bark from toxic berries? Would you trust your knowledge or your panic? Because in the hunger in the Middle Ages, every mistake had a body count, and yet they survived. Not with Google, but with grit, with forgotten wisdom passed around fires made from broken furniture, under roofs patched with straw and prayer. This is what medieval survival teaches us. That luxury is temporary, that warmth is borrowed, and that when it all collapses, only those who remember can continue. So today, as you sip your coffee at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, ask yourself this. What would you do if the only food you had was what you could dig from frozen ground? What would you eat if your life depended on what still grows in the wild? Would you feed your family with confidence, or would the silence outside your door taste louder than your hunger inside? Let us know. If the power vanished at 22 hours of the night at night, what would be your first move in the dark? There are smells you don't forget. In a corner of the village where the smoke from the fires didn't reach and the snow fell slower, something festered. Early pile of roots, covered in leaves, pressed with ash, sealed in mud, not abandoned, prepared. This was not rot. This was intention. The medieval peasant, desperate and wise in equal measure, discovered something modern logic would reject. They learned that when poison hides inside a plant, time and transformation can become a cure, but not any time, and not any transformation. This was calculated decay, controlled fermentation, a secret dance between death and survival. They would leave the roots buried beneath layers of earth and waste. Heat built slowly from below. The fermentation began. It stank. It hissed. It softened the fibers, broke apart the toxic chains that would kill if consumed raw. The stench was so strong dogs avoided the area. Even the wind hesitated. But the peasant knew this was the price of safety. It wasn't science as we know it today. It was forgotten wisdom, rediscovered each winter by those who had nothing else. Sometimes they added animal urine. Sometimes they sang while preparing it, as if a forgotten melody could guide the process. Some even claimed the success of the technique depended on the phase of the moon, but it was dangerous, extremely dangerous. One day too little and the poison would stay. One shift in temperature and the rot would turn into real death. It's said that entire families vanished after trusting a half-fermented batch, and because of that, some villages banned the practice entirely. It became a hidden technique, taught in secret, passed only to the most attentive, the most patient, those who wouldn't cut corners, those who understood that surviving wasn't just about hunger, it was about precision. Still, the need was stronger than the fear. During a brutal winter, when temperatures dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and even the rivers turned to glass, this method, this pungent primal ritual, was sometimes the only line between breath and silence. The peasant who mastered it were respected, feared even, because they had knowledge that could save and or destroy. And once the roots were finally deemed ready, once the layers were peeled and the pulp scraped clean, it was cooked slowly over weak fire, served with silence, eaten with gratitude, because nothing in the frozen villages was more sacred than a meal wrestled from the hands of death. And now, centuries later, we ask ourselves, would you trust something that smells like death? just because someone older than you said it could save your life? Or would your fear keep you from tasting the wisdom that helped entire villages resist the cold, the dark, and the hunger of the Middle Ages? You look into your child's eyes, and they don't even blink. Hunger has made them still, too still. Their hands tremble from the cold, barely gripping the edge of the table. You stir the pot again, not to cook faster, just to feel like you're doing something. But you know what's in there. Not a meal, a test, a root, unearthed in frost, bitter, misshapen, whispering old danger beneath its skin. You peeled it. You soaked it. You buried it in ash. You waited. Not enough time to be sure, just enough to hope. But hope is dangerous in a frozen world. Because if you were wrong, if one detail slipped through your cracked fingers, then what simmers in that pot isn't nourishment. It's quiet death. It doesn't scream. It waits. No one invented an antidote for this. There's no test strip, no undo button. Just memory, just instinct, just the weight of everything your ancestors risked to teach you, now resting in a bubbling bowl at the center of your home. Your child doesn't speak, doesn't ask. They know in the marrow the same way wolves know when snow is about to fall again. This was sobrevivencia medieval, not myth, not legend, a truth buried under layers of ice and time, lived by those who didn't have thermometers, or scales, or faith in data, but faith in scars. They measured safety by stories told near firelight, by what was left unsaid after 22 hours of the night had passed, and the village was too afraid to sleep. In that silence, ritual became survival, technique became whispered prayer, and survival became obedience to the unseen. So tell me now, if your child looked at you, and the only thing between them and the dark was a root soaked in memory, would you trust the old ways, or would you let them starve, because your modern mind couldn't accept a survival no longer written in books? Imagine looking into your child's eyes. They're hollow from hunger. Their hands are too cold to hold the spoon. You stir the pot again, slowly, though you already know it won't be ready for hours, if at all. What you have isn't food, not yet. It's a root. Twisted, silent, still dangerous. You've done what the elders taught, peeled it, scraped it, washed it in river water for days, covered it in ash, let it ferment just enough. You think, but there's still that pause. Because if you're wrong, if one step was missed, if the air was too warm or the moon not quite right, then what sits in that pot is not a solution. It's a quiet poison waiting for a body to enter. There are no second chances, no modern tests, no just-in-case medicine, only memory, only instinct, only the quiet weight of ancestral courage in your hands. And so you wait, with your child watching, not asking, just waiting too. This was medieval survival, not as a legend, not as a fantasy, but as a truth, lived breath by breath in the frozen villages of centuries past. They didn't have thermometers. They didn't measure in grams or calculate pH. They measured with pain, with stories whispered at 22 hours of the night at night, with eyes that remembered who had survived and who hadn't. It was in these moments that instinct became faith, that repetition became ritual, that ancestral techniques turned into silent science. They didn't call it resilience, they called it life. Would you trust your instincts if your child's life depended on it, or would you fear the knowledge that once saved thousands because it no longer fits the world we think we understand? In the heart of winter, when everything else had failed, the medieval peasant turned to what little the fire left behind. Not warmth, not light, but ash. Cold mornings began with silence. You'd walk outside and see the frost clinging to branches like ghosts. Your breath hung in the air like a slow prayer. The food had run low, the river was frozen. And the forest? It offered roots no one dared name. Some were bitter, some burned your mouth, some killed without warning. But in those frozen village, where the wind blew like blades and homes were barely warmer than the air outside, the desperate remembered a trick older than the maps. A technique whispered by the ones who survived the last great famine in the Middle Ages. They crushed the roots, mashed the pulps with stones, and mixed them with ashes. Yes, ashes from last night's fire. Sometimes they added clay, the kind pulled from beneath frozen stream beds. The mixture looked wrong. Grey, heavy, not food, but it worked. The toxins clung to the minerals. The poison bound to the ash and mud was neutralized. What was once lethal became edible, not pleasant, not delicious, but survivable. And in a winter where the sun rose late and disappeared by 16 hours, survivable was sacred. To outsiders, it looked like witchcraft, alchemy, something out of the forbidden scrolls. But to those inside the walls, it was ancestral chemistry, forgotten wisdom forged by fire and failure. Mothers whispered to daughters how much ash to use. Fathers taught sons to feel the texture of the mud with bare hands. They tested the mix not in laboratories, but with the skin of their mouths. One taste, one pause, one breath, then another, then a meal. This wasn't guessing. It was memory wearing the mask of instinct. They didn't know the words alkalinity or absorption, but they knew which firewood gave better ash. They knew which clay didn't burn the tongue. They knew survival not as theory, but as tradition tattooed into their bones. It sounds impossible now, mixing dirt and fire to fight death. But back then, it was just another morning, just another meal, wrestled from a world that seemed to want them gone. And it makes you wonder, if your only chance to eat tonight was something pulled from the ground and mixed with the ash of your last fire, would you take the risk? Or would your comfort with modern life keep you from tasting the legacy that once saved entire generations? If these forgotten memories speak to something inside you, something buried but still burning, join us on this ancestral journey. Subscribe now. Keep this wisdom alive. Winter had teeth, not the soft romantic kind you find in stories or on postcards, the kind that bites slowly, relentlessly, the kind that sinks into your skin, your bones, your breath, the kind that waits in silence. There were no harvests. The last apples had rotted weeks ago. The salted meat was gone. Even the rats had disappeared, or had been eaten. By now the food was what you could dig from the earth, if the earth would let go of it. In these frozen villages, surrounded by snowdrifts taller than the thatched roofs, the medieval peasant wandered with baskets and empty eyes. They weren't foraging. They were searching for anything that looked like it might still hold life beneath the frost. They clawed at the dirt with sticks, with fingers cracked and bleeding. Roots that once fed pigs now became hope. Others, hard as stone, refused to come loose, clinging to frozen soil as if to mock the hunger above. And sometimes they found something, a root, a bulb, a plant half known, half feared, not recognized, but not discarded. It went into the basket, because when the children are crying and the snow is rising, doubt becomes a luxury you can't afford. That night, the fire was low, not for lack of wood, but to stretch the last warmth. Around the hearth, a single pot. Inside it, the contents of that one basket. Boiled, burned, prayed over. A meal not shared, but rationed. Carefully, you could feel the silence. That night, it wasn't quiet, it was the absence of chewing, of laughter, of certainty, because no one knew if what they were eating was safe, and outside the world froze solid. The wind cut through the wooden walls like it had a memory of who lived inside. By 22 hours of the night at night, the temperature had dropped below 5 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that didn't just hurt, it made time feel slower, as if each hour had to be survived separately, and then the snow began again. By morning, one of the huts was silent. Completely, the fire had gone. Out. The door was half open. The snow had covered the steps and no one inside moved. That winter, they said, was the hardest in 3 generations, not because of how long it lasted, but because of how many didn't, and all it took was one wrong route, one plant no one had seen in a decade. Or maybe they had, and just didn't remember the ending of the story. The question isn't whether they made the right choice. The question is, if you were there, in the longest night of the year, your family asleep beside you, the basket half empty, your stomach silent from exhaustion, would you eat it? Would you take the risk knowing the meal could bring warmth or silence? Some didn't wait for the snow to fall. In the stillness of late autumn, while the earth was still warm enough to yield to fingers and the sky hadn't yet turned steel grey, a few medieval peasants moved like shadows, while others chopped firewood, or prayed for short winters. They wandered the fields, heads low, hands dirty, not driven by fear, but by something colder and older than fear, memory, and something even deeper than memory, faith. They harvested not because they were hungry, but because the earth whispered, now. Not the time of clocks, but of moons, of breath, of instinct. No scrolls held this wisdom. No books bore its symbols. Only voices, whispered lips near fire embers, after 22 hours of the night, when only the brave dared speak of the things that saved their grandparents. They believed in patterns, the swell of the tide, the stillness of a rock, the frost that came 3 nights early. Some plants were only touched during waning moons, others wrapped in linen and buried with coal dust. Some were smoked, not to be flavored, but tamed. This was not a technique, it was rhythm, not learned, felt. The plants they stored were not merely preserved, they were blessed. Some were whispered to like old friends, others surrounded by ash circles, and when winter came, when the sun fell before 16 hours, and the cold dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, they did not open the baskets. They unveiled them, like sacred altars of silent survival. Because they were sacred, they weren't just storing calories, they were storing continuity. Each ritual was a defiance, a rebellion against the ice, a statement, we remember. And maybe that's the part we've forgotten. The food wasn't the power. The ritual was. The faith in what couldn't be proven. The audacity to act on wisdom unmeasured by science. To you it may sound like folklore dressed as survival, but to them it was survival dressed in silence. Repetition hiding as resilience. Hunger fed not just by preparation, but by belief. So let me ask you something real. If someone handed you a method that had saved hundreds of lives, but had no explanation, no metric, no test, would you dare follow it? Or would you let your modern doubt bury what once kept entire villages alive beneath the snow? Some didn't. Wait for the snow to fall. In the stillness of late autumn, while the earth was soft and the sky not yet steel grey, a few medieval peasants moved with quiet urgency. While others stacked firewood or patched roofs, they walked the fields, heads low, hands in the soil, guided not by fear, but by memory, and by something older than memory, faith. They harvested plants not because they were hungry, but because the time was right. Not the clock's time, but the moon's, the body's, the earth's. No one wrote it down, no scrolls, no ink, just stories passed from cracked lips after 22 hours at night, by fires burning low, when only the brave still listened. They believed in patterns, the lunar cycle, the temperature of stone, the signs written in the frost. Some plants were only harvested during a waning moon. Others needed to be wrapped in cloth and buried for weeks. Some were hung over the smoke, kissed by fire until they became something new. Not quite food, not quite memory, something in between. This was medieval survival, not a theory, not a method, but a rhythm. One learned with the body, not the mind. The stored plants weren't just saved, they were blessed. Some whispered to them, others lit small candles. And when winter arrived, when the sun disappeared by 16 hours of daylight and the temperature dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, they opened their hidden baskets as if they were sacred, because they were. This wasn't just about preserving food, it was about preserving faith, the belief that preparation done with intention, passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, could carry a family through the darkest season. It may sound like magic now, but to them, it was survival wrapped in ritual, resilience disguised as repetition, and maybe that was the real secret. Not the plant, not the ash, but the belief itself. So ask yourself, if someone handed you a method that had saved lives for centuries, but couldn't explain it in modern terms, would you use it, or would you trust only what fits the science, and leave the rest buried beneath the snow? What if tonight was the last night with light? The fire had grown small. Its glow no longer touched the corners of the hut. Shadows moved in the walls, not because of spirits, but because of silence. Hunger had dulled the voices. Cold had made movement sacred. Each step weighed against the cost of warmth. Outside, the snow had changed. It no longer fell gently. It whispered sideways, riding on wind that could slip through cracks like a thief. The trees didn't sway anymore. They stood frozen, stiff like grave markers for the sun that hadn't shown its face in 3 days. Inside, the basket was full, but trust was empty. The roots, harvested in desperation, had been washed, boiled, stirred with ash. But the room still held doubt. You could smell it more than the soup. A bitterness in the air, in the breath of every medieval peasant who stared into the bowl without lifting the spoon. By 22 hours of the night at night, the last log was placed in the fire, not because they ran out of wood, but because they ran out of choices. The embers glowed like eyes trying to stay open. The hut went quiet. The storm outside grew louder, and the plants, lying there in the pot, looked innocent, pale, harmless. They didn't speak, but they waited. This was the moment that defined medieval survival. Not the harvesting, not the preparation, but the silence before the first bite. The moment when tradition held its breath. When ancestral techniques whispered louder than science ever could. When every lesson, every scar, every buried ancestor came forward in your memory and asked, "Did you do it right?" Because in the Middle Ages, food could save you or bury you. And the only thing more dangerous than starvation was eating without certainty. The families that lived through the brutal winter knew. The ones that didn't became the cautionary stories told in the next season's dusk. So now imagine yourself there, at the table, bowl in hand, the last light flickering. No clocks, no certainty, just warmth slipping away. And your child asking with their eyes, "Is it safe? Would you eat it or would you wait and let the fire die out, knowing dawn might not come for you?" They didn't have books, but they had hands. Hands cracked by cold and dirt. Hands that knew when a root was still dangerous just by touch. Eyes that watched the color of boiling water. Ears that remembered stories whispered by dying fires, long after the winds had swallowed the sound. The medieval peasant was not scientists, but they were survivors. Not because they had charts or manuals, but because they listened to the earth, to the moon, to the silence that came before a storm, to the silence that came after a mistake. Each technique that modern minds might call crude or mystical was to them a thread spun from fear, hunger, faith, and hope, a thread that connected the living to the dead, the living to the yet to be born. In the brutal winters of the Middle Ages, in villages buried beneath ice and silence, knowledge didn't come from ink. It came from survival, from repetition, from watching someone you loved try something and never return. Every forbidden method, every dangerous preparation, every half-remembered chant by the fire, none of it was superstition. It was memory stitched into muscle. It was ancestral code without language. And today, as we light screens, instead of torches, as we store our food behind glass and call that safety, something in us still remembers. Maybe not with clarity, but with feeling. A whisper in the chest when the lights flicker. A chill down the spine when the snow falls faster than expected. A question in the dark when the pantry is almost empty. When we rediscover these ancient ways, we're not just learning how to survive, we're remembering what we once were, and that might be the most powerful survival skill of all. If your heart felt the cold of their winters, if your soul recognized the silence before the fire dies, then you are not alone. You walk among us, the guardians of forgotten wisdom, the brotherhood of those who still believe that ancient knowledge is not dead, only buried, waiting to be remembered. Join this circle, subscribe now, and become part of the brotherhood of ancestral survival. Not just to watch, but to carry the flame forward. And tell us in the sacred space of the comments, which ancestral technique would you trust first to survive a brutal winter? Would you boil, bury, or bless your food into life? If this story touched you, leave your mark with a like, not for vanity, but to strengthen our mission of reviving the courage and knowledge of the past. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that survival isn't just about tools, it's about memory. Saving knowledge can save lives, and don't let the fire go out here. Click the next video now. It's not just another story, it's your next step on this ancestral path. Your next lesson, your next shield against the cold.